Thanks for joining me. Today we're going to talk about how to make your D&D games, or any tabletop RPG game, HOTT, and that's HOTT. So what does HOTT really stand for? So if you guys have watched my series over on the solo RPG, you'll know that I use the acronym HOTT pretty frequently, or you've watched some of the other videos and it's come up here and there. But I wanted to make sort of a dedicated talk sort of about what it is and how I use it and how I think you can use it to improve your games in an aspect of D&D that's a little bit more amorphous. For that, we're talking about the exploration tier, which is sort of the catch-all, almost an upturned umbrella that kind of sits under our combat tiers or pillar and our social engagement pillar. And so anything that's not talking to people or trying to kill people kind of falls into this nebulous area of exploration. D&D traditionally doesn't do a super great job of defining what exactly that's supposed to look like. So today I'm going to talk about sort of what I use, and hopefully that'll be helpful for you. So HOTT is an acronym. It's for basically a common non-combat, non-social exploration challenges that I inject into my games. And this is primarily going to come from sort of the dungeon or very strict adventure design, creating challenges or scenes or encounters, whatever nomenclature, whatever name you want to use for those. What's nice about it is because the HOTT idea is so boxed in, like it has a pretty strong idea about what it is. That means that you can pick up the box and place it in other parts of the game, and we'll talk about that a little bit later when we talk about, okay, if I roll a random encounter, or I just want to inject something into, maybe they're doing some overland travel. We'll talk about all that stuff and how you can use this sort of HOTT framework to kind of drop that in and give them sort of a more finite challenge to deal with as sort of like a scene, rather than have it be anything goes super undefined area that is sort of the exploration pillar, and how you craft that into something that's like a combat encounter or like a social scene, obstacle, challenge, that sort of thing. Sorry, I just used the obstacle, which is part of the HOTT, so I'm trying not to do that, but I just went ahead and did it. So that was, it's not perfect. I'm trying my best. But it's to try to get very specific terms that we can focus on, so we're all kind of on the same page when we're talking about it. So HOTT in general stands for hazards, obstacles, traps, and tricks. So this is sort of the four areas, and those are very, very common sort of challenges. It doesn't include things that are more like mysteries or intrigues or anything like that, because those are more, in my mind, types of adventures rather than specific types of challenges or scenes. Or another thing that you'll notice is that in this HOTT framework, with our hazards or obstacles, our traps and tricks, we don't really mention puzzles and riddles. I'll go through that and I'll talk about sort of the specifics of what I feel falls in each of those kind of buckets, and there is definitely some bleed over for sure. We're definitely going to see that a lot when I start talking about traps and tricks, because it's very similar, and hazards and obstacles can also have a lot of crossover. Why not puzzles and riddles? So I've talked about this a little bit before on the channel, and obviously I've talked about it over on the blog on redragonfiend.com, and certainly anybody who's played with me generally knows my feelings about puzzles and riddles, and that's that I don't really like them, because they do something that not any of the other sort of challenges in specifically D&D, but other games as well, do. It's been my experience. Now, I'm only one person, I've only had some experiences. Haven't had all experiences, and I haven't played with all people at all tables. But in my mind, what usually happens with a puzzle and riddle is when your DM throws it out, one of two things basically happens. The first one is there's a player at the table who is already familiar with this puzzle and or riddle, and they can very easily just look at it and they're going to know the answer pretty much right off the bat. The other one is that nobody knows the answer. And the problem is that when nobody knows the answer, is that puzzles and riddles, you have to build all that and then somehow communicate everything that's in your head to all your players' heads in a way that everybody's on the same page about stuff. And that's really hard to do unless you're using an already very established framework reference point that everybody can kind of draw on. Which again, very difficult to do. Riddles and puzzles often fall into the same, they're problems, and problems have a solution. And that assumes that there's only one right way to do it. Like, there's only one right answer to the riddle. There's only one correct way to complete the puzzle. And then there is advice out there that's like, no, you come up with a riddle, and then if somebody gives you a reasonable answer, then you say, okay, yeah, that's the answer. But riddles are really supposed to be kind of thematic, so that doesn't... It kind of goes against sort of like the whole basis of them. Like parable, fable kind of aspect to them, usually. And so you're using a very specific riddle because you're talking about a very specific thing. And so it should have the very specific answer that matches that theme. It's weird. I don't like to include them because, again, none of this has anything to do with your character sheet and your character skills. Sure, because combat's almost 100%. I mean, not 100%. You can do weird stuff in combat for sure. But combat has the strongest framework around it as to what you can do. And all that's based primarily on character skill. The player skill comes in with sort of like tactics and trying weird spell combinations, or trying to do some sort of clever play that we want to reward for people not just being like, I walk up, I hit him with the sword, I roll a d20, I deal damage, or I miss, and I wait until my next turn. Because that can get really boring. So that's where that clever play comes in, that sort of player skill jumps in. And social encounters have that too, right? Social encounters have to be a little bit more player skill forward, because it's about deciding what you say, and how you say, and who you talk to, and the sort of tone you use, and propriety, and all those sorts of things. Mannerisms, manners in general, and how you speak to people and how you engage with it. But it still has that sort of underlying framework of we have some social skills, right? We have our insight, we have our persuasions, we have our intimidates, we have our deceptions. As social creatures, we have sort of a general kind of understanding about what that's going to be like, and if the DM's doing a good job, you have an understanding about what the world's going to be like and how understand sort of their general acceptance or reaction to different sorts of approaches. And then you, at the end of the day, at the bottom, you have that framework of charisma skills, your insights, your wisdom. You have these fundamental die rolls that we can do if we don't want to 100% make it a player skill back and forth between the Dungeon Master and players about what is successful and what is not. Which is good, because we need that, because not everybody's the greatest role player or the greatest at expressing what they want to say and things of that nature, or understanding it gives us a way to be like, okay, I don't know how to say this correctly, but my character would kind of know how to better say this, because they have this sort of experience and proficiencies in the background. We don't really have that for the most part, especially when it comes to puzzles and riddles. Like, it's really weird to have a situation when you're like, all right, well, I don't know the riddle, but doesn't my wisdom and intelligence 20 cleric and wizard, can't they put their heads together and figure this out much better than I can, because I don't have the same brain stat-wise that these characters have. So that's why I generally don't include puzzles and riddles, because they occupy a weird space. I'm not saying don't include them in your games. If you like them and your players like them, bully for you. Go for it. At the end of the day, it's been my experience that either somebody knows the answer or can figure it out very quickly, or they get stuck and you either have to allow them to do die rolls to give them so many hints as to it feels kind of silly, and then they don't feel great about solving the puzzle. Or you have to force them to walk away from the puzzle for a while, and that's fine as long as that's not a hard dead end, like a break point in the adventure. Like, if you do not get through this puzzle room, you're not going to get through the rest of the adventure. As long as there's some loop in the dungeon or whatever sort of adventure you're planning, that they're going to be able to get to all that other content without having to go through the puzzle door. The puzzle door as an option is super great. that's perfectly fine to put in a riddle or puzzle door that's an option, but it's not going to be, if they can't figure out how to get through there, then they won't be able to proceed with the adventure. One of the things that I do, and I know I've talked about this on the channel before, is that if I'm going to put something like a puzzle or a riddle door in there, they're going to come across somebody in this dungeon that's going to have the answer to it in their pocket. So they can always find the scrap of paper later, because there's some dum-dum that can never remember the answer to the to the puzzles, they wrote it down. And then they pick it up and they go, oh! And then they feel great because they're like, oh, I found the answer, and now we know how to get to that thing. Or they find it first and they're like, what the heck is this piece of paper talking about? And then they find the door and they're like, oh, here you go. So anyways, that's a big start about HOTT. So we're talking about the hazards, the obstacles, the traps, and the tricks, and why we're not really including puzzles or riddles into that. And so let's go ahead and talk about it and kind of dive into each one. So hazards by their nature are kind of neutral. They're not antagonistic in the sense that they don't grok a specific protagonist. It's that if you walk into a dungeon chamber in which there is a hazard, it is usually hazardous to both the good guys and the bad guys. Or if it's not towards the bad guys, it's because we've decided to build some synergy in between the hazards and the bad guys. Like, this might be the reason the Myconids chose to live in this very specific area of the underground cavern system, because there's a whole bunch of poison gas in here and that doesn't affect them. Or that's where all the undead are, because they're immune to poison, and so this is a safe place for them to just kind of be around. Like, nobody else is taking care of them, because anybody else that comes down here has to breathe, and that's an issue. What is a hazard? So in my mind, a hazard is something that's damaging. So it's damaging to be in this place or interact with this place without going out of your way. It's going to be something you're going to have to deal with. You're not really going to be able to get around it most of the time without some magical hijinks or some very, very clever play. So what are hazards not? Well, they're not obstacles. We'll talk about obstacles kind of in a second, then that will probably become a little bit more clear. But they are like I said, there is some bleed over, so they are similar. Obstacles by their nature are sort of more amorphous about how you can deal with them. Hazards are pretty straightforward. To give you some examples of what they kind of look like in different areas, so I decided to do dungeon, wilderness, and urban environments, because you should be able to drop any of these HOTS sort of into any of these realms. Some work a little bit better for each different realm, kind of based off of their nature, because any sort of natural hazard would be kind of weird in an urban environment. But we do have some. So in the dungeon, it can be an unstable causeway. This is something that you have to interact with. You're going to have to go across that. This is very much the Mines of Moria sort of causeway that they walk through that falls apart, that sort of thing. So having an unstable causeway, it's that rope bridge across the gorge that, looks like it's maybe not in the greatest shape, but it is the way across. So unless you're kind of going to really go out of your way to not use it, to avoid this challenge, and that's usually by spending some sort of spell slots or making use of some sort of item, like if you had a flying carpet or something like that the whole group could jump on. Those are really great moves for them, because they're like, oh, well, we just happen to have like the perfect item or the perfect spell or the perfect character ability to get around this. One or more of our party can deal with this, and it's really not an issue for them, which is really nice and makes them feel really good about that character. That's super cool. A classic one that we run across, and that DMs, they always talk about in D&D that DMs hate, Aarakocra or any of the other sort of limited races that have fly to them, especially at low levels, because they're like, well, they just make things way more difficult, because they can just get away from danger, and they can go around so many hazards and exploration challenges and things like that. It's like, yes, that is technically true. There's stuff you can do with that to ameliorate that, especially on the combat side, which is always the weird side for me. But on the dungeon side, like with this causeway example in the dungeon, we have this giant sort of gorge or chasm or endless pit, right, that we don't want to fall into, and there's this causeway across it, but it's like a crumbling stone edifice. It's like, walking across this, there's a chance that we're gonna tumble down into the darkness below, and then you might not have anything planned for if that happens. What are we gonna do? And they're like, well, I guess in my mind I'd be like, all right, well, I guess we're gonna do an Underdark adventure then. Wasn't planning on that, but that's where we're gonna go. if people start falling down that endless chasm in the bowels of the earth. But going across that causeway, if you have somebody who has fly, you're like, oh great, I just fly across. That's one member of the party. Two, if they could carry somebody across, but most of those PC ancestries that have a native fly speed, have some pretty strict conditions about carrying. So if they're in a point where they can't even wear something like medium or heavy armor, they certainly can't be grabbing and carrying across somebody who also is wearing armor or anything like that. So it's more of a load thing. That they can really sort of carry that. And that's something that usually don't try to get into the nitty-gritty rules of this that much, especially in 5e. But this would be the sort of area where I'd make the difference between this is not a carry weight. This is a lift weight. You are trying to lift somebody and carry them, not just carry them with your feet on the ground. So it's slightly different. Like, you have to keep both of you aloft. So that's when we'd look at that, and we might have to look at some weight things, which they probably won't be able to do. It's great. They can get one person across. They can figure out some clever thing to do with like a guide rope or something. Great. They're dealing with the challenge. That's what I want them to do. Perfect. It doesn't mean you all have to go across the causeway. It just means that it's a hazard and you have to deal with it. You have to come up with some way. Also in the solo RPG, we had that chasm that had the upside down reverse gravity that was blinking in and out. Like that's a hazard with a giant chasm underneath it. Like, had to come up with some way to get across that. It's all about sort of having them come up with clever ideas of how to deal with this, because I don't care. I don't have a very specific set in my mind way to deal with that. They could also just, for an unstable causeway, they could just decide to try to walk across it. So acrobatics checks to sort of get across. Maybe if we get so many fails, that's when things start to crumble, and part of it falls off, and now they've got to do the balancing, and they've got to make a jump check to get across, and do that athletics. So we can do some things, and it's a little loosey-goosey, but allows me to kind of look at the list proficiency of skills. Be like, okay, these seem like a good way to get across, or if you guys have any other crazy ideas that you want to try out, we can like pitch them to me, and I'll see how that might land mechanically, if I can make that work. I will try to yes and most of that stuff if I can. So that's sort of dungeons. So in the wilderness, we could have, for hazards, blizzards or some other dangerous weather event. Those are really easy ones. Some sort of terrible storm that happens. Flash floods, landslides. There's some latent hazards like the causeway that they don't do anything until we start interacting with them. Then there are other ones that are sort of like these dangerous events, whether that's thunderstorms or blizzards, landslides, earthquakes, things of that nature. They are more active. They're going to come at us. They kind of make attacks at the players instead, and then they have to figure out how to deal with it. And you could turn something like a blizzard or a flash flood into a very sort of like extended, almost like a chase or flight kind of scene if you wanted to. So it can always be a lot of fun and can be a cool way to sort of inject that more natural encounter style. This is the kind of stuff that I find helpful, that I think you guys will kind of find helpful too. And so hazards are something that they're gonna have to interact with. And then on the urban side, the easy example for me was fire. Fire breaks out in the city. That's a hazard. Most buildings are made out of wood, and cities are basically one big matchstick, and you can get stuck in the middle of that and figure out what you're going to do, especially if in an urban sort of situation, the fires. It's going to take a very high level player character with very specific spells prepped to deal with something like that. Sure, otherwise you're kind of not that much better than a bucket brigade as far as putting out fires. So it's an interesting way to think about sort of, do they run into burning buildings and try to save people? Do they just try to get out of the city as fast as they can, because there are going to be mobs of people rushing the gates as well, and so that's a more extended thing that they have to deal with? Do they go over the walls? Do they try to find an area that they can secure against fire and hunker down there and maybe try to save people and bring them to this sort of safe spot that they create in the city. So how they interact with it is going to be wild, right? We don't know when we throw that sort of out on the table what they're going to do. Focus on doing those character skills with clever play. So do they have cool spells they can use? Do they have abilities that, or proficiencies with tool sets they might not get a lot of use out? So with that fire example, I'd give the ability for a character who had something like carpentry tools to be able to give me some sort of check if they're trying to identify a building that's going to be particularly fire resistant, or whether when they're looking and trying to get people out of a burning building, who's going to be able to assess if this building's about to collapse on them if they go in there or not. Something, do interesting things like that. Like even in the landslide example, I might even be as generous as to allow somebody to try to make some sort of knowledge check with their pottery tool proficiency and be like, oh well, you know a little bit about soil composition and clay and how water and dirt mix. So yeah, sure, I'll give you, this will give you some insight as to whatever they're trying to do. Hopefully they will be getting creative and they're not just like, I want to run away. But yeah, that's hazards. So hazards are pretty much something you're gonna have to deal with. They're gonna come after you, or they're put in a place in which the players have to interact directly with it usually. They may or may not be able to change the nature of that situation. Kind of like with the urban fire, talking about a fire in a city. I mean, like, you're probably not going to be able to just stop the fire. Let's move on to obstacles. So obstacles again are pretty neutral. They generally don't care what side of the conflict the people dealing with it are on. So unlike traps have trap setters, so there are people who know about the traps, where they are and how to use them and what they do, and then there are people who are hopefully being caught unaware by those traps. Obstacles in their nature just kind of are, you can think of it as sort of a broken down car in the road. And be like, you can deal with this however you want to. You can go around the car. If you can figure out a way to go over or under that car, that's fine. You can stop and try to help that car and get it pushed off the road. It's a thing that's in the way, and then you can go through it, you can go over it, you can go under it, you can go around it. I don't care how you deal with it. This is a problem, or not a problem, it's an obstacle. So problems have solutions, obstacles you just have to deal with it. I don't care how you deal with it. And depending on the dungeon, and if we're making a good dungeon design with things like loops in it, with looping passages and ways to get to everything, multiple ways to get to kind of everything within the dungeon, you can look at an obstacle and be like, I don't really want to deal with this. We're going to find a different path around. And that should be an easy way to deal with the obstacle as well, is to decide to not interact with it. So that's sort of what it is. It's more like if you screw up interacting with them, they're probably going to end up being dangerous for you, but not by their nature dangerous. So down here in the examples for under dungeon, I put chasm. So if you have a big hole in the ground, yeah, that's a problem, but it's not a problem until you start dealing with it. You can just be in a room that's got a chasm with it, unless you walk over to the edge and peer down over it and lose your balance. Not really going to be an issue. If the tension's feeling kind of low, right, they've been maybe skirting through some encounters, or they've avoided some stuff, they've been pretty clever, that might be one of the things where I might want to ratchet up the tension a little bit. Be like, well, as a person comes over to explore it, unless they're being extremely careful, be like, oh, well, the edge of this is crumbling, and now we need to make some deck saves just to kind of spike that tension real quick, and be like, oh, you thought this chasm was going to be very, very safe, the edge of it was going to be very safe, but inside it's very much crumbling. And just to inject some danger, raise that tension if I need to do it. Otherwise, it's fine. They can walk up to the edge, they can look down at whatever's in there, whatever they try to do with it. Maybe they'll decide to go down in there and try to explore it. Maybe they'll decide to figure out a way to, they might just be able to jump over it. They might need to find out some way to get everybody across with ropes, or a ladder, or a walkway, or a spell, or something to get everybody across if they want to get across it. Or they may decide, well, let's see what else is in the dungeon, and if we can't find a way Because if you think of a dungeon room that's got that, it's got the deep hole in the middle of it, and then there's a door on the other side, and you go, well, let's keep going around and see if there's another way we get to that door on the back side. And then maybe we don't have to jump across this giant pit that falls into darkness. Yeah, in the wilderness we have the sheer cliffs, ravines. I realize I'm mainly doing falling stuff, but that could also be a raging river, something like that, rapids to get across. Even something as much as like dense jungle foliage that they just have to, they can either decide they wanted to bushwhack and cut their way through, or try to go around and find a place in the jungle that's not quite as dense vegetation, that's going to be a little bit easier to get through. And then they'll have to wonder, is like, okay, can we get around it? Can we tell how large the super dense growth is the thing we're looking for in that super dense growth? It gives them options about how they want to deal with it. They might decide to take the time and go all the way around whatever maybe the central thick growth of vegetation is. If they go around and are able to sort of assess the size, they might go, okay, well, we think there might be something in there because it's pretty large area, so let's go ahead and bushwhack away into the center and see if it opens up any. Or we'll go through some other examples here in a bit, but just sort of, these are very much just sort of classic examples to show you how you can do this in the dungeon, in the just landscape around the dungeon, or more precisely the dungeon, the land in between, and then our settlement over here. So it kind of shows you how you can use this HOTT framework in all three of those sort of separate arenas that most D&D and other sort of fantasy action-based RPGs kind of happen in. If you really want to extrapolate this idea out, a desert by its very nature is sort of an obstacle, because it's like, yes, we could just go around the desert, but that adds a lot of travel time. But we could go through the desert, or we could come up with some really great way with that's some sort of trickery. Maybe it's an airship or a sand sailing ship or something like that, a way to quickly get through the obstacle and not have to deal with it as much, things like that. But it gives them the option that they could always go over it or around it or below it. That's usually a concrete way to think about obstacles, is that can I go through it or around it in some way without really having to deal with it as much. If the answer is yes, it's probably an obstacle. And then the urban side, we have things like, I used crowded parade. It's very easy for obstacles sometimes to think about, actually for all of these, is think about sort of classic movie examples, something like that. How many movies have a chase scene that's got a parade that they use for one way the party that gets away from the others? They did that in like the latest Indiana Jones movie, which, I mean, not a super great movie in general. It did use that. It's a very sort of classic movie trope, is to have that sort of chase and then have people trying to get through a crowded marketplace. That's another one. The stubborn donkey that's decided to lay down in the middle of the road, things of that nature that you can kind of get through. And you can use those, and because obstacles are neutral, if you're chasing somebody, they can use it to their advantage to slow you down, or if you're being chased, you can use it to your advantage to maybe slow down the people behind you. If you decide to make a mess, do the classic throw over the trash can so the other guy maybe trips over it, that sort of thing. That is the sort of vibe that we're kind of going for, just maybe on a slightly grander scale. So we've got traps. Traps are always going to be negative because traps by their nature are artificial in some way, that a creature kind of sets it up to do something. So they're negative. There's always going to be, because there's intent behind them. There's not any intent behind hazards and obstacles, but there is always an intent behind a trap. What is a trap and what is not a trap? So traps, like I said, are generally artificial, so they're man-made in some way or made by some sort of creature. They can be magical, they can be mechanical, doesn't matter either way. You can even see that there are traps that take advantage of natural surroundings and things like that. So they might be, you can use a hazard and turn it into a trap if you're doing that. So if you imagine, let's do that classic dungeon room that's got a chasm in the middle of it. You want to turn that into a trap. You have a spellcaster who has a very, very big major image in front of it. That they do it Looney Tunes style, where they just paint a visage that there's nothing in this room and you can just walk across it. And then that first person just keeps walking, they hit the middle of that room, and there's not a step, and they just fall. And anybody who watches them walk into that, of course, they disappear, because they disappear into the illusion, and then just start yelling, and they're like, whoa, what's going on? So what is it not? Like I said, there's not going to be some sort of artificial design. If there's no artificial design behind it, then it's not going to be a trap. But it generally means that whoever set the trap, and if they are denizens of the dungeon or the area, that they know about it and how to avoid it. Smart bad guys will try to funnel the player characters toward that if they can, or take advantage of it as part of their battle tactics. One of the downsides about traps in dungeon design is that the moment that you hit your players with the traps, their progression through the dungeon is going to turn into a snail's pace. Because once they learn there's traps in the dungeon, they will check every stone in that dungeon for traps. unless you want to deal with them trying to check every single hallway and every single door and every single wall for some sort of secret hidden clue and or trap, you need to keep them going on. That's usually one of the things where I'm like, alright, here, we're going to make a bargain. So generally we use your passive perception to determine whether you see a trap or not while you're marching down the hallway. If you tell me you're not actively looking for it. Now you're telling me you are going to actively look for it. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to add 5 to everybody's passive perception score. So everybody gets to add 5 to that passive perception score to see it, because you're taking your time. The problem is that you're taking your time, which means for as long as you're doing that, every time that I'm rolling for wandering monsters, I'm rolling for wandering monsters with advantage. You take more time, you're more likely to get into more fights. So that's the trade-off. How do you guys want to proceed? And so that's a way where, as DM, you can step in and be like, there's not really a super great mechanic for this, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use what I know about the rules, and I am going to invent a mechanic for it. Which is the bargain. So you want to make sure you don't get hit with traps. That's perfectly fine. But you're more likely to get hit with random encounters, because you guys are really, really slowing your progress. So in the dungeon, we have the classic poison dart trap. Everybody likes it. Does what it says on the tin. In the wilderness, that could be something like a tiger pit, like punji pits, anything that's got sort of those guerrilla tactics, snare traps, the pulled back branches with the stakes driven into it and stuff like that. Those sorts of things, tripwires, all that cool stuff. All the very classic trappy kind of things. The easiest one I can think about for sort of the urban side was an alarm spell. So alarm spell is trap. I can delve into this in probably a different video if you guys are interested in really digging into traps. But traps, in my mind, kind of do 4 things. They're either alarms, they do detainment, they have murderous intent, or lockdown, which is a little bit different than detainment. The easiest one is probably the classic, pit trap, or the trap door. You step onto it, it drops you, and then you slide down and shoot into a dungeon cell. That's a detainment trap. It's detaining you. A kill or murder trap, it tries to kill you. That's the most common trap we come across in D&D. But it's not the only one. But alarm trap is one of them. It's an alarm system. You cross it, it just alerts everybody that you're here. And that makes things more difficult for you. And depending on how the alarm spell is set up, you may not even know that you've tripped it until a whole bunch of angry bad guys show up at the door while you guys are sifting through the room trying to look for clues and treasure and all sorts of stuff. You're investigating the room, and then suddenly a whole bunch of bad guys ready for a fight bust into the room behind you. Lockdown is the classic art theft. You go in there and you set off the alarm, and then the bars come down around the doors and it traps you in the room. It keeps you from getting away. It doesn't deal with you specifically. It's not specifically trying to trap you, because you're still in the same room with whatever that priceless artifact is. But it's going to keep you here until somebody comes to deal with you, basically. I don't really need to spend a lot of time on traps. I'm pretty sure we all know how traps work for the most part. And we know how it's different than a hazard for sure. And that we probably have a better understanding now about how traps are different from obstacles. Traps are often hidden. They don't have to be hidden, though. They can be very overt. And then let's talk about the last one, tricks. which is just a little bit different. And I use traps and tricks interplaceably. Like, kind of swap them back and forth pretty easily. We don't see tricks too much today in modern dungeon design. If you think about traps being harmful, tricks don't also have to always be negative either. They can sometimes be positive. The classic example to think about them is this one down here. It's the sex switch fountain, which is a classic D&D one. Is that there's a fountain there's tons of fountains in old D&D modules. If you drink the water, it changes the sex of your character. That's it. It's kind of a curse. It's technically a curse, but I mean, it's not. Especially if you're playing a modern D&D, you don't have to worry things about like it's actually adjusting something like your strength or charisma or comeliness rating, as they had in old school D&D for a brief moment there. So it just sort of changes their sex, and I'm like, okay, so it doesn't have a super big impact of it. It's just kind of mischievous. It's kind of annoying. It's not really super hostile most of the time. But it is a way to sort of do things like curses and weird magical effects, things that are not basically necessarily like harmful or hostile in a lot of ways. It's just kind of silly. So it kind of depends on you as a DM and the game you kind of run, and specifically the sort of adventure or dungeon that you're playing in. If you're running a classic D&D Gonzo Madhouse dungeon, you're gonna have tons of tricks in it because nothing in here makes sense. All the stuff's silly and very silly and made up, and wizards being wizards, am I right? Tricks can also be very useful if you really want to push themes of like outsiders, and by that I mean sort of like aberrations and fiends and fey creatures, sort of creatures, and they're like, oh, they have these weird things that people deal with, and they're like, yeah, this is annoying. It's mercurial, though. It feels like, why would somebody make this? Why would they put it here? Why would people interact with it, assumably knowing what it is? To kind of give them this idea that this is built by somebody with an outside frame of reference, this sort of like non-human intelligence, so they don't have the same thought process and ideas about the world and the universe and how things go as we do. Their perspective of everything is very different, and so that can help you. The tricks can be helpful in that way to sort of like dial in the weirdness scale sometimes. But yeah, I'm gonna make a fountain that's then every time people drink out of it, they get that they become sort of bubblegum cheery, and for the next I don't know, they fail your con save maybe the next few hours. Maybe I'll have them roll a d6. I was going to say the entire day, but I'm pretty sure my players would get really tired of that very quickly if they had to play their characters as being that super Genki, like upbeat, cheerful kind of everything's gonna be all right in the end kind of way. So if you want to up the silliness, wackiness factor, use more tricks. So obviously they're not traps. So if you're trying to think whether this is a trap or a trick, that should be pretty obvious. Does it really cause some sort of harmful intent? Is that harmful intent the sort of primary effect that this is supposed to have? And or is it hidden? Because tricks are generally not hidden. They're usually just hanging out. They're sort of like obstacles in that way. They're usually just sort of hanging out in the middle of a room, just begging for players to come around and interact with their characters so they get hit with the tricks. It's just sort of like a point of interest in a lot of ways. And maybe they figure out what it does, and then they're like, I'm not touching that. Okay, that's fine. Moving on. Or, if you put the red button out there, somebody will press the red button at some time. In the dungeon, we have that classic sex switch fountain. In the wilderness, it could be like a fey hedge maze, where the maze actually changes as you're going through it. I think, every time you switch directions or you make a turn or something like that, so parts of the labyrinth move around. And so it's basically impossible to accurately track progress through it. Which can can be fun, but can also be really frustrating, depending on your players. And then the urban, I had a gaggle of young wastrels following and annoying the group. That's sort of like a trick, especially if you have characters who they've decided to interact with this group of young wastrels in some way, and now these young wastrels will not leave them alone. And if they're doing anything that's kind of sneaky or stealthy, or they're looking up, trying to figure out sensitive information or rumors or things like that, and they just have a group following them that's loudly talking about what they're doing while they're doing it, and things like that, can be a lot of fun, but also, of course, can be annoying for your players. So tricks, I think, more than anything, is definitely one where you kind of need to do a vibe check with your party and be like, are people enjoying this as I'm doing this? Are they laughing? Are they having fun with it? And then when it stops being fun, that's when you let it go. And then like, oh, well, be like, okay. And then they decide, all right, well, we'll find something else to waste our time on. So everybody's kind of on the same page about, hopefully now, about what is a hazard, what is an obstacle, what is a trap, and what is a trick, and how are those things not the same, and yet what is each one of those things individually. Alright, so these are the hot tables I took from my DM binder. So you basically just, because of their nature, I put hazard and obstacles together, and then traps and tricks together. So 1d20 hazards and obstacle types. And these are super general, and they're by nature kind of boring. That's okay. We can add stuff to it to make it more exciting. We can talk about that. Wide chasm. We talked about that very straight up. Is there a trolley? Is there some sort of built-in way that people have already made to get across this? That's interesting. And then you can think about, okay, is that still working? Is that still... Or has that become sort of like our causeway situation with a hazard? So there's a wide chasm, and there's like a cable trolley or something like that. But it doesn't look like it's maybe in super great condition. So you guys can try to use the cable trolley to get across here. Or you can try to figure out a different way to get across that chasm. A chasm that's going to be too wide to jump, obviously. If somebody has the jump spell and they have it loaded or have a scroll of it, I might let them jump across it. I would have to think about how actually wide is this chasm. Narrow chasm. So we have wide chasm, we have narrow chasm. Is there a bridge across it? A very simple one, right? We have the causeway, then we can run across it, something like that. There's a lake, which is a big thing of liquid. That's what it is. And can you take is there a boat that goes across it? Something like that. These are really fun. You want to throw a big underground lake into your game. Be like, all right, there's a lake, and you're in total pitch darkness and in an underdark sort of area. You guys have your lanterns and or dark vision. You're like, great, you guys can see 120 feet. You see water at the end of your vision, and as far as you can tell, water continues. If they have that torch, they have that or lantern out, they can see 60 feet of bright light, I think, and then 60 feet of low light, and then maybe another 60 feet. But at the end of that, that's only 180 feet. So if somebody had, they could see somewhere between 120 and 180 feet into the gloom. And if they're doing that, well, lake's probably larger than that across. So they go, and you see water stretch out, and you have no idea how far that water stretches until somebody uses like a big like daylight spell or something like that, if they want to throw that as far as they can in front of them. And then, you know, it's like sending up a big gigantic flare, and it lights up the whole place, and now suddenly you can see, okay, this is a giant lake that's over there. How are we going to get across this? Can we swim across this in the dark? What sort of crazy monsters are in this lake? You know, you can do that sort of stuff and throw that in front of your players and let them chew the fat on it for a little bit, what they want to do. And then, of course, if they get in that sort of circular motion, that's when we start applying that watering monster pressure. It's like, okay, you guys can't just sit here for a day and talk about it. What are you guys going to do? Polar pond is the same thing. It's just smaller. They probably don't need that. There could be a bridge across it, though. Again, what is the condition of that bridge? Does the bridge have any sort of weird thing on it? Is the bridge a mimic? The bridge... the bridge as a mimic would be a very funny one. I'm not sure that my players would enjoy that, but it would be funny to have the bridge be a mimic. Or the boat, for that matter. If we want to do the lake boat, the boat's the mimic. Then it just becomes a really small combat, though, and that's, in a lot of ways, less interesting. So, I mean, it kind of just depends on how you want to go at it at that point. But yeah, you see a lot of elevation bases in here. We see a lot of water bases or fluid. Any of these lakes or pools or ponds or rivers don't necessarily have to be water. They're just liquid in nature. If you wanted to make an acid lake, I'm not going to stop you. If you want to throw that at your players because you have players, like all your players have swim speeds, and then they go to swim in and be like, whoop, that's not water. Our swim speed is useless here. What are we going to do about this? Something like that. So we have this, we have river, we have fluid-filled chamber. So if there's anything they have to go underwater with for some amount of time to interact with, you can do, if you have a stairway that leads down into water, and then there's maybe 1 or 2 completely underwater chambers they need to go through and then come back up on the other side, but they might not know that those stairs come back up on the other side. So you either telegraph that and make it clear that, hey, there's stairs that go down here, there's something down there, and then on the other side of the room you can see that there are stairs that come back up out of the water. They do that a lot in sort of like the more recent Assassin's Creed games a lot of times, where they have a swimming aspect to it, where you have some underwater chambers and puzzle stuff that you have to swim underwater for. And there's times when you dive in, you're like, you don't really know how long you're going to have to be underwater in a passage. Which is one of the big differences between playing like a tabletop RPG versus something like a video game. So a video game, you have specific mechanics and everything's tailored to those specific mechanics. Whereas in a lot of sort of D&D or TTRPG worlds, you might have those sorts of things, but because we don't have such a very restrictive mechanical sense, so you can do anything, you can try anything, you have wacky spells, you have weird non-human abilities, you guys can do all sorts of weird stuff. So it's up to you to try to figure out if you can get past this, and if the answer is yes, how you get past it, which is a different sort of idea. We have our permanent spell effect area. It's very easy to think about the tiers of play. So if you have, let's say, a 3rd level party, you can pull up the 3rd level wizard and be like, okay, do they have access to first, second level spells? Okay, then I can just pick a 1st or 2nd level spell and be like, okay, that spell is just always going on in this room. So you probably don't want to pick something like Fireball, where the room's just constantly being hit by Fireball spell effects. But you could, and that could be fun. But you don't have to. It's more interesting to do something that's got some sort of wonky spell effect. A good one to toss in there would be invisibility. So the moment people walk into this room, they become invisible. All creatures become invisible. Now you guys have trouble interacting with each other or knowing where each other are. Are there monsters in this room? Because then you're going to have invisible people bumping into invisible people and trying to attack each other. But those of us who read invisible, know the invisible spell carefully, know that the moment you make sort of like a hostile action, you lose invisibility of the spell. So that might be a way to get around it, is that you guys decide to attack each other, and then that allows you to see each other for a round and do something, and then the spell resets and you turn invisible again. It'd be a very interesting way to do it. So they're kooky, right? This is how it works, is that it's super kooky. Fungus, mold, slime, super easy stuff. Slimes that are not like creature slimes in D&D, but just sort of like random goo. Lots of fun things to like throw conditions on, things of that nature, hallucinatory stuff, poison effects, all that good stuff. You can drop those on as hazards and obstacles. Noisemakers. We have the Shrieker mushrooms, which are really good at showcase of this. They are technically a creature, but they're a 1 hit point creature that don't have any attacks. All they do is, when you get close to them, they make a foghorn sound. So it kind of works as a natural alarm spell in that way. Sticky goo, vegetation, or webs. We have a lot of spells that do that, and a lot of sort of things that are in the D&D world that do that. Things that are going to grab or stick to your characters or make them sticky, so when they roll up against stuff, they press up against the wall, they get stuck to the wall, and do all sorts of weird stuff like that. Most of these rooms, when we talk about these hazards, obstacles, traps, and tricks, usually are not just sitting in a room by themselves in a vacuum. This is a good example of that. So the sticky one doesn't really do anything all that much by itself other than be annoying and maybe have some fun times with your friends at the table, having to deal with something that is very silly. But if they have those sticky cobwebs, obviously when you throw a spider encounter at them, it really puts things in the favor of the spiders, right? If you have a hazard and you have a room that's completely covered with super sticky cobwebs, and that makes it more difficult to fight the giant spiders that are in the room, but the giant spiders don't have any issues with those things. Anytime that we throw in flora, you add that into that sort of trees and shrubs and grasses and all grab grasses and things like that. They can do conditions, they can do damage, they can do difficult terrain, though difficult terrain is its own thing in here. Unstable ceiling, floor, pillars, etc. Yeah, we talked about that already with the causeway. Super easy. You just have something that looks like, if you guys hang out here for a while, yeah, you're probably going to get hit with this. Or if you make too much noise, something's going to crumble and fall on top of you, or you're going to fall through it. In solo RPG, we had that happen not that long ago, 2 sessions ago, with HOTT. Disease, gas, poison. Some of these are straightforward. I'm probably just going to rock through these really quickly. We know what poison gas does. You know what poison liquids do. And diseases. Diseases are a little bit more amorphous, especially in 5th edition. But there are some diseases and curses, and you can look at things like that for ideas. Some sort of barrier or impassable terrain. A collapsed dungeon passage. That's a barrier or impassable terrain. Yes, technically you could take the time to clear that blocked passage, but is that going to be worth the time? You're going to spend a lot of resources to do that. You're going to have to do a lot of wandering monster checks to get through that. That might give you exhaustion because you're going to do hard manual labor for many hours. Even if you clear that passage, then more of that passage won't collapse on you when you're trying to go through it if you clear it. Things to think about. Trivial monster swarm. We talked about that sort of with the slime above, but usually like vermins, biting insects, things like that. They're really more of an annoyance than they are an actual threat. Fonts and geysers that spew out acid, gas, lava, etc. Steaming water. Light and obscurement. We can always play with those. Those are always fun to play with. So there could be fog, shadows, lack of light, some bioluminescence that maybe does things. Maybe bioluminescence that also works as, where was it up here? Bioluminescence that also works as a permanent spell effect area for fairy fire and is lit up by sort of the luminance of the mushrooms or whatever the vegetation is that's giving that off. Wild magic surges. You can go look those up in the book. Any wild magic surge table where it just has weird stuff on it. It's a fun thing to throw in there if you want something really, really random. And if you're really leaning into that gonzo silliness of your dungeon or whatever sort of adventure you're trying to build, yeah, throw that in. Wild magic surge is also a good one if you're doing stuff in extraplanar stuff in weird sort of fey areas, even domains of dread, things of those nature. And then the bottom one is sink, some sort of a sinkhole, mud, sand, tar, so quicksands, super aerated water, and just a sinkhole in general, all that sort of stuff. Those are all hazards and obstacles. So the easiest way to do this, so obviously that's a 1d20 chart, that's what's in my handy dandy DM binder. If you want to know more about what's in there, I've got a video about that, so go check that out. But the best way that I like to use these tables, especially small tables like this, is to roll twice on them, and then see if I can combine those effects again. Because then that turns a 1d20 table into a 20 by 20 table, which is a 400 result table instead, that you can make very easily. Actually, it's less than that because you're going to have doubles. It's a lot more than 20. Let's just put it that way. Let's just search for 1d20. So, okay, let's say I was rolling on this hazards table. I'm going to roll twice and see if I can combine them. What do we think we're in? I think we're in a dungeon, just so standard dungeon crawl is the example. We're in a classic underground dungeon. There is a river that passes through it. So when I roll doubles, that just means it's the riveriest river that's ever rivered. So I'm like, oh yeah, it's super deep, it's super fast. You can see that there's all sorts of rocks and all sorts of nasty stuff that's in there. If you fall in this thing, that's going to bump you in, and then the current's going to slam you against the wall on the other side. Something like that. To make it be like, this is just a dangerous, river, underground river surging with water. How do you guys want to deal with that? I didn't think I was going to roll doubles on these, so it's nice that I rolled a double right off the bat. So let's roll again for something that's not doubles, so we can actually illustrate what we're talking about. 2 and a 7. Okay. That's a little bit easier. So we've got 2. So we've got a narrow chasm. So some sort of crevasse that's in the room. Narrow usually means that, like, yeah, you could probably jump it. It's probably not that far away. And it may or may not have a bridge against it. So that was it. So we got a bridge, or not a bridge, a narrow chasm, and a permanent spell effect. Let's just steal this one from Indiana Jones. There's no reason not to. Be like, oh yeah, there is a chasm. A narrow chasm. And yeah, it has a bridge across it. Problem is, that bridge is invisible. So unless you guys take the time to find out that there is a bridge across there, you might be running across something, and then if we have monsters in the area, I'll give them a chance. I probably give them a good roll. Be like, okay, do the monsters know that there is an invisible bridge in here? This would be like maybe an oracle die roll. So I roll a 1d20 on 11 plus. It's good. We're gonna give them a modifier. Well, if they live here, it's pretty likely that they probably know there's an invisible bridge here. They probably come across it. So plus 3 to the roll. 6, 7, 8, 9. So no, they don't. They in fact do not. You go to push somebody into the chasm, and they fall back, and as they yell, and then they just slap on this underground bridge that's across the middle. And then you guys realize, oh, there's an underground bridge. There's like an invisible bridge that's here. So these are very super easy to deal with. Let's go ahead and hop down to Traps and Tricks. So Traps and Tricks have a little bit more to them, but this one's only a D12 table because as I was trying to go through it, there's so many traps, and the traps tend to do things that make other sort of challenges, and we've got one down in here, which is like number 9, where you have a trap, and the point of the trap is that it awakens or summons a creature, and so it just makes a combat encounter, which is an interesting style of trap. So, like I said, there are the 4 sort of primary traps that I talk about. Alarm or Alert, which is going to give you an immediate random encounter roll, and might give me as a DM advantage on some random encounter rolls later. Maybe for the entire dungeon if I'm feeling froggy. Because you guys unfortunately set off an alarm, so everybody knows there's intruders in the dungeon. So they're on the lookout for you. Detainment, we talked about that. That's trapping your characters in sort of like a jail cell, like putting you in something like that. Lockdown, which is similar to detainment, but is actually more about, the point of lockdown is that it keeps you from getting out of the dungeon. It's going to remove points of egress. So you're not going to be able to get out of the dungeon. So it could be the front door that locks down. It could be this chamber that locks down. It could be very specific passages that lock. Things like that. And then, of course, our lovely number 4, which is just, it's a murder trap. It's trying to kill you. So it just does hit point damage. 8, other one. So Resource Eater, which means it's going to do something like, instead of doing direct hit point damage, it does something else. It takes some other resources away from your character. Hit dice, spell slots. It could be a weird magic trap that takes away very specific character abilities, if you want to. Like, what if this is a trap that, it's a blind statue that's holding an orb, and the orb shoots out rays as you go across the room. And if it hits you, you lose your dark vision until you take a long rest or something like that. And then, right, we telegraphed it because you have this statue that has a blindfold on to tell you, hey, here's thematically kind of an idea of what this trap's going to do. And then it shoots you with the magic thing and you lose your dark vision. Or maybe it just blinds you, but that would technically be a harmer trap, which is our next trap, which talks about giving you some sort of condition or exhaustion, diseases, curses, things like that. So Resource Eaters and harmers I really like using those, because people don't think about it very often, and be like, oh, this trap doesn't do like standard hit point damage. Instead, it does things like take your hit dice away, so it takes away your character's ability to naturally heal themselves, which is different, which can actually be much more dangerous in the long run. And then we have, of course, the harmer traps. Anti-magic or dispel trap. You walk in there with a whole bunch of magic items loaded up, as player characters always are, with magic items. You walk into this area, this chamber, or whatever it is, you set off the trap, and now there's an anti-magic aura on the room, and now none of your magic items focus, and you're not able to cast spells in here. Same thing with Dispel. Dispel could be like a temporary suppression. If you really want to get rid of a character's item and make them work to get it back or something like that, you can just dispel magic from them, or dispel magic will work on something like mage armor that's been cast, that the wizard casted on themselves, and then they're like, nope, your mage armor's gone. It got dispelled. You didn't make the save. The animator just animates a gear, an object, something like that. So that could be a trap that's defensive in nature. So one of my favorite ones is for an animator example, because I feel like you probably need an example for this one. So one of my favorite classic animator ones is that you interact with something in the room, and then you have the classic walls closing in on the chamber, right? The chamber starts to crush you. It animates the room. It animates some sort of object. If you have a weapons rack and maybe you do something, all the weapons are turned into... no, that would technically fall under Awaken. I was going to say that you have a whole bunch of like flying swords and things like that. So that won't work. But the animator could, if you wanted to use it more as like a trap rather than a combat encounter, it just makes all the weapons on the weapon rack fly off towards the player characters. It's just a one-time trap kind of thing. And then on top of that, we have Charm or Mind Alteration. There are a ton of spells that we have access to. Check out some of those spells. You can do one of those. It'd be very funny. It's very fun to have a Charm effect one that just, the more times, and I'd probably make it a little bit more subtle. It's like a growing thing, and then it's like every time that you're in a room and you fail this charisma save or whatever it is, there's no sort of immediate benefits, but it slowly endears you more to the people who live in the dungeon. So you go from being like fully hostile to just kind of being unfriendly to them, and then kind of being like meeting them on middle ground, and then you keep failing and you're like, actually I kind of like these guys. And then if they failed like everything all the way to being almost servile towards them, being like, oh, these are great people, I'm ready to join them and serve them to the fullest. I will dedicate my life in service to them. So you can add those sorts of things in. If you want to get really, really wonky and weird in here, you can absolutely do that. Teleportation, classic one. Tomb of Horrors does this right in the bat. It's a very classic teleportation trap that's pretty early in the dungeon. That once you walk into it, it just dumps you back outside, and you gotta start the dungeon all over again. If you wanted to build a room that was like multi-story, maybe it's like 3 stories, and up at the top of this, maybe towards the exit of the room, is the teleporter trap. This would be a really nasty one if you wanted to combine this with the room filling with water. So it's a stepped up, and then when you get to the top next to the exit, there's a teleport trap that teleports you all the way back to the bottom entrance. And so as the water, and if you do yeah, that'd be fun. You make a trap that fills with water. The trigger for that's very early in the room, so they trip it very early. And then they're rushing up the stairs to get to that top level. They get to the door. They're trying to rush out of the room because they know it's actively filling with water. They step on the teleporter trap. It teleports them all the way back to the entrance, which is now underwater. And they have to swim up, and they're just trying to beat the tide and get all the way back up there, and hopefully not hit the teleport trap again and get zipped back down. So it's just sort of a treadmill kind of style room. It's a very fun design for a dungeon kind of room that they have to figure out how to do. Especially if you're trying to make it a little bit nastier, and you're like, okay, the trigger for the teleportation is actually on the door handle itself, like that area of the door, and the door's locked. So the rogue's trying to, the first thing they're going to be, so to give you a little bit more of the treadmill. So they run up there to get there, they grab the door to open it, they get teleported back down. Okay, but they realize it's locked. They go back up there, and they're going to try to stealthily unpick the lock, teleport you back down. They get back up to there. Okay, now we just need to break down the door. So they start trying to break down the heavy door as the water continues to fill in the chamber. And there's your tension, right? Trying to get through that and get everybody out of here before this room completely fills with water. So super easy one example to kind of come up with. When you try to take two and combine them, you get a much more sort of interesting room or encounter or things like that, rather than just being like, oh, it's a room that fills with water, or having a weird teleportation trap that just you interact with something and it teleports you somewhere else. But let's do a 2d12 roll. I know I just gave an example. Let's do another example that's not me sort of cherry picking. 8 and 11. All right, so 8, we've got the animator. Okay, I guess I won't, because 8 and 11 is exactly what I just talked about. Gotta love that. I guess the dice are shining on me a little bit today, which is a change of pace for the past like couple weeks, where I've been rolling real bad on everything, on all sides of the table, all sides of the screen, and all different tables. It's just been real cool with different dice too. Is the thing. I'm just on a cold streak, it seems like. All right, so well, we can add the other parts on it, which is the trap trigger and the trap reset. So, what is a trap trigger and what is a trap reset? Well, the trigger is obviously how you set that off. I was just talking about that, so let's roll a d4. So 1, which is a sensor. So if that teleportation at the top, it's just a sensor. As you get close, as you get within, let's say, 10 feet of the door, if you're not, it's like a motion sensor. If you get picked up by it, boom, it teleports you back down to the entrance of the room. So now they've got to figure out a way to how to stealth up there and unlock the door while being stealth to open the door, so everybody can try to get through here before that chamber fills with water. Now that one, if I'm going to do that, obviously we want this with the teleportation thing. This is going to be an instant trap reset. But some traps you want to know whether they're one-time things or they're going to keep going. So in this time, it's a one-time thing, I believe. Yeah. Trap reset of none. So maybe you only did that once. You may decide to do that. You might decide to have the trap have a recharge. I didn't put that on here. I guess I could put that on here. Under time. Let's say time/recharge. So if you want to do something, have a dice roll mechanic that's a little bit more like Dragon's Breath, where you do those limited abilities where it's like, okay, he does Dragon's Breath, and then every time his turn comes up, I roll a d6 for the dragon. If I roll 5 or 6, they get their breath back and do their breath again. You can just set that like that if you want to, rather than make it timed. So the trap triggers are sensor, so it sees you, pressure or touch, which is the classic floor pressure plate, as well as you just touch something and it goes off. You touch the trap. Trip lines are like that. Trip wires, things of that nature. All fall within that. Wrong interaction. This is the classic. Not what I'm trying to click on. There we go. Wrong interaction is a very classic. Let's say like the Indiana Jones idol thing is a wrong interaction, or if you go to unlock a door and you don't beat it, you get hit with a trap. It sets off a trap instead because you tried to open a door that was still locked. Yeah, that's actually a really good one to talk about with wrong interaction. Is the classic. We're gonna reference Skyrim because everybody's played Skyrim. Those trap chests in Skyrim where it's like, oh, you go to open the chest and it has a trigger on it that immediately drops those fire pots or whatever it does. Whatever that trap does. Has a swinging thing that comes down and hits you, etc. So that can be a wrong interaction. It's like, but somebody who knows about that trap knows not to do that, or how to, or at least stand to the side when it happens, depending on what the trap reset is. Because in Skyrim we have those. Well, let me do it different. So the instant recharge, or one that's not really a recharge, is like the swinging pendulum axes in Skyrim. Those are basically an instant reset because it does one swipe, immediately resets, another swipe, immediately resets, another swipe. Or something that's got like a timed or recharge would be like the swinging gate ones that have the spikes on them, or the ones that have the log or pillar that come out and smash you from the ceiling, and then they swing back up, and then there's like a little bit of a timer recharge so that you can watch it sort of crank back. But yeah, I mean that's pretty much all of them. So I talked about how most of these are not living in a vacuum by themselves, and that's because of our dungeon, the way that I stock dungeon chambers, which is down here, because I did have this up, which is right here. So you can see on here, when I roll a 3 or a 4, that means there is a HOTT in here. There is a hazard, an obstacle, a trap, or a trick in this room. So this is super easy. I've certainly gone over this before in my 2d6 tables video, but in case you haven't seen that video and you want to know what I'm talking about, and this is a heavily modified from the 1d6 table from basic D&D about in its section for figuring out what's in a dungeon chamber. It uses a 1d6. I changed that and I made it 2d6, and I changed a little bit of what things are. So I'll roll one. So for each one I roll 2d6 and use both those results. So if I roll a 1 or 2, it means that this chamber doesn't have anything in it. Remember, that's why we roll twice. So I rolled a 1, so it's just empty. But if I had rolled a 2, it means there's empty, but there's also a treasure in here. But this was just 1, so one of these results was empty. And the other result was empty with treasure. So empty and empty, so this room is absolutely empty. This is a room that does not have some sort of HOTT obstacle challenge in it. It doesn't have any creatures in it to challenge. It's devoid of anything. It's just a blank room. It's nice every once in a while to have in your dungeon. And if you have dungeons that are mostly filled with stuff, if they come across a room that doesn't look like it has anything in it, they're going to be very suspicious of that room. They're going to think there's a trap in here or something hidden, which is good because there is a treasure in here. So if they root around a little bit, they're going to find some sort of treasure, which gives them an idea to, even in an empty room, to address it with caution. It's an empty room. That's no different objectively when a character's coming in there, any different from a room that has that chasm in it that we have the illusory major image in front of. They look like the same room. One of these rooms is dangerous, one of these rooms isn't dangerous. So if you think about that from the player's perspective, if they come across an empty room, they're gonna be like, I don't know if this room's actually empty or not, which is why I use 2 dice. If I used 1 die, there's a 1 in 3 chance that every room was just flat empty, which is a lot of empty rooms in a dungeon. But if I add 2, and we'll just say, I added a second dice here, it makes it more likely that the room's going to have something in it, even if that thing is hidden. So it's very rare that you just have a blank room. And even this isn't a blank room because we rolled a 1 and a 2. There is treasure. There is something to find in here. But of course, if they spend the time to look for treasure in here, I make a wandering monster roll. If I ever roll a 1, well, they're in trouble. There's going to be some monsters that find them while they're in here investigating the room. So I did 1 and 2. Let's kind of go down the list. 4 and 2. Okay, so this is a very interesting one. So 4 is a HOTT and a treasure, and I rolled a 2, which is empty and a treasure. So down here you'll see at the very end here, I have on doubles the result is significantly more in quantity or potency. So this room is empty. It has some sort of hazard, obstacle, trap, or trick in it. And then it has double treasures. Which means, the way that I've started interpreting that now in my games is that if there's a double treasure in there, it means that automatically there is a magic item in this room. And now that could be a potion, it could be a scroll, it could be a super powerful weapon. And this doesn't tell us, and I'll make that decision as I'm playing, if I'm playing live, or I'll decide while I'm making the dungeon whether that treasure is out in the open or whether that treasure is hidden somewhere in the room and they have to find it, because they could always not find the magical item in the dungeon. But so this could be the difference between walking into a room and it's like the Chamber of Time from Zelda, and you're like, yep, there's a big magic sword in the middle of the room that I can pull out and use. Cool. Now, of course, if you do that, if you put in D&D a room that just has a sword and stone kind of aesthetic to it, they're going to assume that they're not going to be able to pull that sword out, or that there's going to be some sort of trap if they try to interact with that. So it's okay to let them wheedle on it a little bit and waffle back and forth about whether they're going to mess with the sword and how they're going to mess with the sword. If they start spending too much time, then you do the random encounter rolls. In our last video, we talked about the instigator sort of player character archetype, is that there's going to be somebody in the party, probably, statistically somebody in the group. It's going to be the person that at the end of the day is going to be the one that hits the big red button and does the thing. You just got to wait for it, and then if they take a little too long, you put a little pressure on them, and then that'll hasten them to either take it now or come back to it later. And let's do another one. 4 and 1. All right, so I have these memorized obviously by heart. 4 is a HOTT, so our hazard obstacle trap or trick with a treasure, and 1 an empty. Let's do another roll, and this time we'll kind of build it out. See what it looks like. Full. All right. Let's do one with a HOTT in it because that's 2 creatures. Well, let's talk about the 2 creatures because we haven't talked about it yet. So 5 means there's a creature encounter. 6 means there's a creature encounter with a treasure. So that means we roll doubles on our creature encounter, which means there are either more creatures than we expected, or they are of more difficult quality. So this is going to be a hard fight, harder monster that's in here, or there's going to be a lot of monsters in here, which is a different way to scale difficulty. So either the CR goes up or the amount goes up, the volume goes up. Because we do know, especially in 5e, that difficulty is oftentimes more set by action economy, which means more creatures, more actions. This should be a difficult creature encounter. Now, I do use the term creature encounter because I don't make any indication whether this is going to be a social encounter or a combat encounter. It's probably, most of the time, it's a combat encounter, or at least it evolves into a combat encounter, knowing my players. But there is sometimes the options to talk things, and I might make a reaction roll for them, which let's just say I did that. Alright, so I rolled a 7, which is right down the middle of the road, so their immediate sort of reaction to the player characters when they come in here, when they first spot them, is unless they're doing something that gives them some intent, some tip-off as to their intent, they're gonna regard them as sort of guarded, but open to communicating. They're not immediately hostile, they're not immediately friendly. They're just kind of like, okay, we're doing our thing over here, you're doing your thing over there. That's fine, we're not going to have any issues. We'll talk to you, we might do some light trading. But if you come sneaking in here, your rogues coming in here sneaking it up and they catch you, well, then you're telling them your motivation. They're going to be much more likely to try to capture you or attack you right off. So let's do something that's got an actual HOTT in it. Alright. Cool, double, 3 and 4. So that means a double HOTT and 1 treasure. Alright, so we need a HOTT. So this is where it's nice to know about, the condition helps inform us how many hazards and obstacles there are, as opposed to workable traps and tricks that are still in the dungeon. So I rolled a 2. A 2 on this means it's good. So there should be about a 4-to-1 ratio of traps and tricks to hazards and obstacles. So it's in pretty good condition, so most of the stuff still works in here. So let's just roll a... We said it's 80%, so if I roll a 1 or 2, it's going to be a hazard or an obstacle. I did. It's a hazard or obstacle and not a trick or trap. Now, a nice thing to do in something in a dungeon like this where you're in an area of an otherwise pretty well-maintained dungeon, but you're maybe in the more decrepit area here because it's broken down, is to actually have a malfunctioning trick or trap. And so now it's more of a wild magic thing. So keep that in mind. Alright, so we know that this is a hazard or obstacle, and it's going to be a nasty one. 6 or 11. Alright, so 6, fluid-filled chamber. Okay. 11, floor that does some sort of condition or damage. Interesting. So my first thought went to, alright, so we've got the fluid-filled chamber. So there is a chamber that's going to fill with water. So a very classic trap, you step in, you do it, the water rises in the room. Absolutely. I'm just going to go with straight damage on this one. And I think this is going to be sort of like a... I think they're going to be like hanging vines down from the ceiling, and I'm going to give them... they're going to be like an electric reel. They've got like a charge to them. The water's going to fill in this room. Or I guess the water is filled. Let's do it that way. This chamber is already filled with water. So there's an underwater area that you got to get through. And we're going to use these. These are, instead of hanging down from the ceiling, we're going to make them come up from the ground. And these are like these gigantic sort of like seaweed forests. they're underwater, but they've got that, let's change it instead of a condition, instead of damage. We're going to give it a condition, and this will be like the paralyzed condition. So they hit it, they get they get shocked, and they get paralyzed for a round. And now we're starting to track more about this. The hazard of this room is more about keeping their breath, because they have to get from one area to the other. And there's this gigantic sort of underwater mangrove of these electric charged seaweed that's going to zap people as they're going through it and paralyze them and make it more difficult for them to get through, because they're going to need to get through that while they still got breath. And this is the part where I'm going to probably not follow because of the nature of this challenge, we're going to depart from what is the normal sort of hold your breath rules, because I think you only have to make the con save if you take damage, and these aren't going to do damage. So we could do it that way if we made them make damage, and then they have to make the con save. If they don't make the con save, they lose their breath, and now they kind of start actively drowning as they get through there. That makes it a very dangerous trap very, very quickly, but this is supposed to be a really dangerous trap, so I might do that. So let's go with that. So we've got this underwater chamber that you can go into and they can try to go through. They can see the open doorway at the other side, just barely through all the seaweed that's going back and forth. First person's going to go in there and get hit with that paralyzation. They're probably going to pull them back out of the water so they can figure out what's going on. Realize that they have to get through there, and then maybe they're going to have to figure out some way. Maybe they can figure out a way to... They're not going to have a lot of ability to do a lot of fire underwater by its nature. By the nature of it, being underwater. Do a lot of fire damage to the plants or anything like that. But they could do like a blight spell on it. That would be super useful. They have the Dust of Dryness magic item. That would be a good use for it. Or if they have there's some beads, right, that allow you to soak up a bunch of water and hold a bunch of water. And so you can take those out. I think there's like 6 of them in a pack. You can toss them in there, and they take I think it's 5 cubic feet of water and pull that in. And then if they pull that in, they do 2 or 3 of those. Now they can lower the water level in the room enough that there's at least some area of air across. And being seaweed, the tops of it will never poke out of the water. So they make some free space, and they can use a spider climb across the top, crawl across the top above the water and get over it that way. Right? We're just giving them options, and then it's up to them to try to figure out how the heck to get through this thing. And it's dangerous. And then we said there's a treasure, so there's maybe some treasure down there. Maybe some coinage, something like that. Or maybe if we wanted to make it real nasty, we make it look like it's a lot more priceless treasure than it is. So if we put what looks like a jewel-encrusted sword down there, but maybe they get down there and they find out that it's actually like costume jewelry, or maybe it's an illusion or something like that. It's actually just a normal old rusty sword that's down there or something like that. That's something that's more mundane rather than a magic item. It's super easy to do, guys, once you get it in here and start doing this. So these are my lists, but there are tons and tons of similar lists like this, roll tables out there for hazards, obstacles, traps, and tricks. Choose your favorite. You may already have a favorite one. If you have a favorite one, use that one. The only thing that I would say is different is try this right here. Try to do that as double rolls, because those work a lot better in my experience. Those are really great. Instead of having a 1d20 table, it makes you almost have a 1d400 table. It's less than that, obviously, because there's duplicates, and it's going to give you the imaginative juice to make sure that you're not using the same exact hazard, obstacle, trap, and trick again and again and again and again. Now, we saw this already. I did roll doubles, but that's actually pretty rare here. Let's do a trick. Let's do something that's tricky, which actually we should be rolling d12 instead. 5 and 9. So let's do something that's a little bit more trick adjacent. 5 and 9. So it's a resource eater, an awaken or summon monster. Perfect. I'm just gonna make these do the same thing. It's gonna bring up some sort of creature, and the creature itself is maybe it's like a massive stone construct that's blocking a doorway. Like it is the door. Like it is a stone construct that is the door. And so you set off the trick is that you awaken. It's not even like a trigger. Like there's clearly like a way to maybe there's a little bell or something with a little hammer next to it, and you pick it up and you just bing, and as the chime goes up, it awakens the construct, and then it's up to you to decide how you get through that. So maybe the only reason the thing is there is that it demands a toll, which is the resource eater. It asks them to, make some sort of blood sacrifice, but instead of doing straight hit point damage, you're like, okay, but it actually takes one of your hit dice. Maybe it has some sort of innervating ray that sucks that out of them, like a tractor beam for their health. It just kind of pulls their health out of them. They might have to sacrifice some sort of latent spell slot. That would be a really good one. So you have this magical construct that is the door, and they need you to sacrifice magical energy, which in turn bolsters the construct to stay alive and continue to be sort of the door guardian. And then at that point, they can decide, they can talk to it, try to convince it to let them in if they, for some other reason, if they don't want to do the sacrifice. They could straight up fight it if they want to do that, I guess. Sure, why not? If you put a creature in front of the players, there's always the chance they're going to kill it, so keep that in mind. But that's just another example. So it's really easy to just sort of like just grab them and roll twice on the chart and try to stick them together. No, let's do one more example, except this example, I want to do a non-dungeon one. Let's just roll. If I roll high, it'll be an urban one. It'll be like a settlement one. Otherwise, it's going to be a wilderness one. Alright, so we're going to do an urban one. Just for fun, let's do our 2d6 roll. 6 and a 4. Okay. So there's some sort of creature involved in this. They are some sort of HOTT. Let's roll again for kind of what's going on here. 1. Okay, so that's perfectly pristine. So it's absolutely a trick or trap. There's another character or another creature that's in here, and there's a very lucrative treasure in here. So some sort of magic items in here because we roll treasures on both of these dice. So there's a lucrative treasure in here, and maybe you're competing with another creature to get it. Like you get in here and there's already somebody else trying to grab it before, and now you have to maybe. You can try to work with them, but probably they want the thing. You can try to. Maybe it's two parties that are in competition for the same thing. So it's probably some sort of humanoid because we're in a settlement. And so let's figure out what our trapper trick is. 8 and 5. Alright, 8 and 5. So a resource eater. And an animator. Interesting. So animate some sort of gear or object. We've been doing something that eats spells, maybe. So there is some sort of area. Why would this be in the settlement, though? Maybe that's not a great example. So the example I wanted to do was sort of like a pillar that's got a magic to it, and then if you trap this, instead of eating resources off of you in that sort of spell slot hit die way, what it does is that it acts like a super electromagnet for magic items. So it's just going to suck everybody's magic items towards it. So if you have this other group and you guys are, I don't know, let's say it's here's a good idea. So if I was trying to make a scene for this, I'd say let's do like a magical auction house thing, and your group and another group are competing for the same magic item that's on auction. And there is this sort of anti-theft pillar here that's that super electromagnet only for magic items, and so people have to walk by it. It's part of the way to sort of get into the auction because they don't want people using charm magic and things like that, obviously, in a high stakes auction for magic items. So they don't want that, so they have this sort of thing that's sort of like a metal detector but for magic items that you have to go through. And so maybe they've already figured out how to sneak around that when they're getting in there, and somebody's done that, and then somebody can trigger the trap, and then it stucks everybody's magical items to it, including the magical item that's on auction will fly off and get stuck there, and then everybody's magic item gears are just like stuck on this magic pillar. that they're gonna have to do like strength, maybe big strength checks to like get it off or figure out how to turn it off. And you have these two opposing factions that are your group and now this other group that wants that magic item, kind of bickering and fighting with each other, trying to figure out how they're going to get it out. So that's one way to drop something like this in a settlement that makes sense. They're still going to be weird and fun, and it's a little bit better than just having a bickering match with a different sort of rival adventuring party. Yeah, I think this is a good amount of examples. Hopefully you guys got a lot of good information out of this, and you see it as a great idea for something that you want to start implementing into your prep or into your own personal DM's binder to help you sort of run games. I do recommend making one of these bad boys, which is your own little personal DM binder. Mine's a DM folder, technically, I know. I have a lot of improvisational tools in here, which is like these tables that help me improvise hazards and obstacles and traps and tricks on the fly if I need to do that. How to run chases and escapes, the proficiency lists, what the monsters are doing pre-fight. So we can roll that one real quick. So we're gonna have this bickering match with this other party, this rival adventuring party. But what were they doing before that? Before everything came out? Oh, they were themselves having an argument. They were probably having an argument, so that's when you first catch up with them, is they're having an argument with the proprietor of the auction house staff itself about, because the auction house staff is like, no, you can't have your magic items in here. It's like, we're not giving up our magic items, blah, 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 back and forth. And so that's sort of how the player group runs up on them and sees them. And originally it's like, oh, these guys are, I guess we have to give up our magic items if we're going to come in here and bid for this item. How do we feel about that? Maybe there's some way we can sort of sneak some magic items around, give them to the roguey type, and they'll figure out how to get around, or something like that. Right, we're just planting seeds, and we're just going to let the players, they're going to water those, and we're going to see what grows from it. We're just giving them situations, giving them setups, and they're going to giving them obstacles, and they're going to figure out how to get across, get beyond all these things. But yeah, that's going to be it for me today. I hope you guys enjoyed this. These videos are always fun. I wasn't quite sure what I was going to talk about today until yesterday. I was like, oh, we'll go over the hot stuff, because I haven't done that yet. And I know I've had multiple people sort of ask me about it. So I wanted to make sure that I did it. We have it all in one place now. You guys have that as a reference. Go out there, build your own tables. You can copy my tables, but I think that you should make individualized tables that kind of fit your style as a GM. But it is useful to go out there and grab already built tables and pull out the stuff you don't like and kind of kit bash those together to make your own tables. I think that's the best way to sort of do it if you want your very specific style table. If you want to check out more stuff, we got more videos. We got the solo RPG series. Check that out if you want to see a bunch of this sort of stuff in action. We also have a full playlist of sort of the DM advice stuff that I've been sort of slowly making and building on that resource. So if you want more content like that, there's plenty of that out there for you to check out. Otherwise, it's very helpful if you like, of course. Very helpful if you share this on Reddit, social media, your preferred tabletop RPG forum, whether that's Roll20 or Ian World, D&D Beyond, wherever it is that you go to talk to other people about D&D stuff. Feel free to share. That's always very helpful. We have, if you want to give me a few dollars, there's always the DriveThruRPG store that we have that has a few items in it, so I'll pay what you want. So if you like some of these resources and want some of them for yourself, some of them are up there. Go and grab them. If you want a specific topic covered next time, leave it in the comments. I think that's it, though. You guys enjoy the rest of your weekend, or whatever day it is, and I'll talk to you guys next time. All right? Bye.